So Games Workshop's big reveal just took place today, and alongside some gorgeous new cinematics and teases that the Necrons may be the next big antagonist in the 40k narrative, Games Workshop saw fit to announce the release of the 9th edition of the game. Expositing wild predictions about what 9th edition's rules might perhaps look like has been a trend on YouTube for the last couple of weeks, and you know your boy is a mindless automatonic slave to YouTube trends, so let's do that too and go over the rules hints that GW has given us so far and talk about what 9th edition may look like. So alongside some new units for both Necrons and Space Marines that were previewed, including Necron Warriors with a new Gauss Reaper weapon, Marine Primaris Assault Intercessors that come stock with a heavy bolt pistol and chainsword, as well as some large Necron Spider constructs, and a potential hint that the Silent King will be fieldable as an HQ choice on his own mobile obelisk-looking thing. Games Workshop gave us a couple hints to the rules changes that we may see in 9th edition. We got an inside look into some of the design philosophies that the design team was moving forward with in 9th edition, including applying lessons that the design team had learned in the rollout of 8th. Hopefully, that means that this edition's launch will be a little bit smoother than previous editions, since as far as I know, the release of 6th through 8th all have had their own suite of problems. Well, with their track record, I can't imagine Games Workshop pulling this off flawlessly, and I'm sure we'll have some balancing issues and some growth pains when the edition releases, but I am hoping that we see a smooth transition from 8th to 9th edition, and it sounds like 9th edition will be fully compatible with the existing 8th edition rules, so hopefully they've made that job fairly easy on themselves. The design team told us that every unit in the game has been looked at with potential point adjustments made, potentially working in conjunction with their new list building app that they also previewed. While the design team said that close combat armies would be helped by the rules in the new edition, some of the rules that they previewed lead me to potentially think otherwise, and we may be pigeonholed even more into a gunline style play than we are in 8th, but we will see. And we also told us that rules and mechanics have been designed to more accurately reflect the way the units are meant to behave in the background, creating a more intuitive and flavorful game experience. One of the big additions, in my opinion, was the announcement that Mike Brandt was joining the team to help them develop missions and run their live events. For those who don't know, Mike Brandt is the logistic mastermind behind the Nova Open, one of the US's few super major tournaments, and an incredible charitable foundation that raises hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. While I don't always agree with Mike Brandt's design philosophy, I'll always hold up the Nova format as an example of competitive play, and its pioneered developments in the community such as preset terrain layouts and more balanced and dynamic mission play. I do think that Mike Brandt has his head on his shoulders and will be a positive contributor to both the team and the balance of 9th edition. So that sounds good so far, and with that in mind, let's go ahead and delve into the rules previews that Games Workshop gave us. First of all, they announced that armies would in general have more command points available to them. I think that's great. Command points tend to peter out around turn 3, and players get less use out of their interesting stratagems towards the late game. That makes late game play a little bit less interesting since the reactive play that stratagems offer is a little stymied. They also mentioned that we would see less souped armies in the game. For those who don't know, a souped army is an army based around a super faction keyword such as Chaos or Imperium, rather than a sub-faction keyword such as Space Marines or Sisters of Battle. That creates kind of bizarre-looking armies where you can have a Space Marine detachment to bring in artillery, a Custodes detachment to bring in bikes and tanks, and then backed up by Sisters of Battle or Astra Militarum to give you easy access to CP generators. A lot of times it breaks the aesthetic of an army, and while flavorful, and I do like adding options to the game, it can sometimes create oppressive combos when you mix together 3 or 4 codexes worth of stratagems that the designers may not have intended. Well, I think Soup overall is a positive contributor to the game because opening up list selection like that and making the opportunity to build fluffy lists like Space Marines drop potting in to relieve besieged Imperial Guardsmen or something like that is always good. And with that in mind, the design team has opted to keep the option to build these lists in the game. However, it sounds like they will cost you additional command points to build armies using multiple sub-factions. I think overall this is a positive contribution to the game as long as it doesn't pigeonhole list design too much. It can definitely create interesting choices in the list building phase between unlocking your powerful combos or having more CP just to play a more standard game for a longer time. Secondly, They announced that tanks would be able to fire while engaged. They didn't really give us any more information on this particular change, and honestly, I have mixed feelings about it. On one hand, it's awesome that enormous vehicles like Land Raiders won't be tied up by a single orc boy and locked down for the rest of the game, leaving a 200-point investment totally useless. But on the other hand, if the intention is to make close combat armies more viable, making them unable to stop artillery fire by engaging it could be a death blow. That said, we don't know the specific wording of any rules yet. Meaning that the specific rule itself could have a lot of drawbacks for the tank. I imagine that a tank engaged in melee would only be able to fire at units outside of melee with it, and potentially could only fire at units that aren't in melee with other things, meaning that engaging a tank army across the entirety of the front line would leave most of them unable to shoot anyway. I have heard rumors that falling back may be being nerfed as well, which makes engaging models in close combat a little bit easier. It'll be interesting to see how all these rules work together when we find the final wording of them when the edition releases, but I am tentatively excited to see some tank armies back on the table. A big focus of the announcement was new terrain rules. One of the biggest criticisms of 8th edition terrain is that it's functionally useless. It gives you +1 save, and sometimes it stops you from charging. And there's some more arcane rules that typically no one plays with because they require very specific terrain sets. But it doesn't block a line of sight. As long as you can see one iota of a model through a terrain piece, you can just shoot them with everything. The terrain doesn't really matter, especially if you're using GW-specific terrain, which typically has a bunch of holes in it. It's got big blast craters and windows and all sorts of garbage that you can just shoot people through. So the design team made a point of focusing on the fact that new terrain rules focusing on balance, as well as a better system for cover and terrain more consistently interacting with line of sight. They mentioned that buildings could be defended, terrain could block line of sight to allow movement up the table more easily, but made it sound like terrain might stymie close combat a little bit more than it does already. Honestly, this is the part of the announcement that I'm most excited about. The 8th edition terrain rules are god-awful and a perfect example of terrible game design, and have required multiple house rules or very specific terrain sets to be built by the community to make the game almost playable at all. Well, it doesn't sound like GW will be changing their philosophy on the line of sight rules. If the terrain rules are a little bit more consistent than a true line of sight system, I guess it's okay, but I would like to see it go. They mentioned several times new rules for strategic reserves and new ways to bring your reinforcements in from table edges to try to outmaneuver your opponent. This is one of the most exciting parts of the game because it allows a lot of player choice and requires a lot of counterplay. A high volume of strategic reserves are always very exciting and dictated on how well the players can maneuver around each other. I am excited for this, and I would absolutely like to know more, but the design team was not totally forthcoming with what these new rules would entail. Next up, they mentioned a revision to the explosive weapons rules. They said explosive weapons would be better against hordes and deal maximum hits on a variable hit weapon. For example, a battle cannon shooting D6 shots would get an automatic 6 if it was shooting at a horde of infantry. How I imagine this will work is that variable shot weapons will get a minimum shot value when targeting units of a specific size. For example, a D6 weapon would become minimum 3 if it fired into a unit of 20, or minimum 6 if it fired into a unit of 30 models. While I don't like this change because it probably makes the armies I play easier to kill, I do like it in that it is much more flavorful, and it was always weird that explosive weapons were usually better at shooting at single targets than a whole horde of infantry. Hitting a single target with D6 battle cannon shots is much better than hitting a bunch of dudes with a D6 that could be a 1 if you're shooting at 20 models, but now it makes target priority with those weapons a little bit more interesting. I am excited to see how this role pans out, but I do hope that horde armies get a little bit of love, because right now in the meta, they are so easy to kill. Hopefully these new terrain rules will see them a little bit more well defended and able to block line of sight to those big heavy artillery pieces. Lastly, the design team that mentioned that aircraft attack runs are back. Way back in the day when aircraft was released, I remember them releasing back in Apocalypse, and they had an infinite amount of move and could leave the table and enter on different board edges, representing them screaming around the battlefield, doing strafing runs. Honestly, this freaks me out. While the aircraft rules in 8th edition are wonky, they are designed for balance and solid design. A lot of players eschew aircraft because while they're very powerful, they're hard to use, and a misposition on your part could see them run off the table by a cleverly deployed enemy. With the ability to pull them off the table, that makes them really hard to kill. Hopefully we'll see a significant decrease in aircraft resilience, maybe removing their -1 to hit or cutting their wounds number in half to make up for the fact that they can just escape the table at any time if they're in danger. I think may be a good balancing point. It'll be interesting to see how Games Workshop decides to tackle this rule, but I am a little worried that it could create even more negative play experiences than the existing aircraft rules. With all that in mind, the design team did make it clear that it seems like 9th edition will be more like an 8th edition redux than a full overhaul of the rules. While they've rebuilt rules like terrain from the ground up, it sounds like a lot of the other rules will remain relatively the same. That's unfortunate because I know a lot of people had some really high hopes for an enormous overhaul to the 40k rules, potentially repairing some of the perennial problems that the system has had over the decades. With that in mind, I'm going to go into my wish list for some things that I would like to see in the 9th edition rulebook. The first two, like I just talked about, are probably not going to happen, but this is a wish list, so I don't care if it's realistic or not. I'm going to wish upon a star. The first one is the removal of true line of sight. This should probably speak for itself, and if you watch my Legion line of sight update video, you'll probably know why I don't like it. It opens the door for lots of negative play experiences, awkward situations, and modeling for advantage, and doesn't really bring anything to the table. It makes the specific model on the base part of the core balance of the game, and disincentivizes players from modding or incentivizes players to mod their models, try to get additional line of sight, or hide more easily. It's poor game design, and the industry has moved past this kind of rule like 20 years ago. That said, a big change like this is something that I imagine the design team would have talked about in their reveal video, especially in conjunction with the new terrain rules, which are supposed to interact with line of sight a little bit better. We'll see if the new terrain rules can help alleviate this problem a little bit, or if a couple more basic line of sight rules can do the same thing without really overhauling the system. While I do imagine that we'll keep a similar system to what 8th edition has, I do think that there is a possibility for a little bit of an update to make it less ambiguous. The second item on my wish list is a crazy one and would require a total overhaul of the game, so I don't think it's that realistic. If anyone's played the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game, which has since I think become the Middle-earth strategy battle game and or the Hobbit strategy battle game, it's gone through so many names over the years, you know that it was a shining example of really brilliant game design from a very early stage by Games Workshop. Lord of the Rings plays with a series of combined phases where players alternate taking actions. For example, in the movement phase, all models moved, with one player moving their entire army first, but the order in which they took their movement phase was determined randomly. Then the same order was used for shooting and close combat, which was helped by the fact that close combat was resolved simultaneously in that game. This created, honestly, a quite realistic feeling game where losing priority on any one turn could decide the fate of the battle, and being able to pin your opponent's models in place before they're able to get their commands ready to declare a charge could be the difference between victory and defeat. The game as a whole almost felt historical in nature. It felt like it very realistically captured the swirling and chaotic feel of a battle and created a variety of incredibly interesting tactical situations that 40k just doesn't. In 40k you move and then you shoot and then you charge people and that's all you're going to do. But in Lord of the Rings, the position on your table, trying to bait out your opponent's charges, or set up in case they win priority, was a much more interesting system. It also helped to alleviate the downtime that players had, because you would go straight from your movement phase to a very short shooting phase, and then you would have your own shooting phase. So you would never be sitting at the table for 30 minutes waiting for your opponent to shuffle all 100 of their models around. I think a combined system like this could be perfect for 40k, especially if it adopts a more alternating activation style. While I honestly don't love most alternating activation games for the sheer fact that they move the focus of the game to activation control rather than actual damage output or the rules on your data sheets, I think in a system like 40k that's broken up into multiple phases, it could actually be very interesting. This is especially true in the shooting phase, when alternating your units shooting could allow single powerful units to fire before they're taken out by overwhelming enemy firepower. This is often a negative play experience that's talked about in 40k, where you put a Knight Titan on the table and 20 las cannons shoot it and it immediately dies. In an alternating activation system like that, if it had the opportunity to shoot after just a couple of those las cannons hit it, it could make the game much closer and more interesting. Again, this is a change that I imagine the design team would have spoken about in their reveal video. And since the 8th edition codexes and supplements are fully compatible with 9th edition, I think it would take a complete redesign of the entire game, and so it doesn't sound like this is true, but a man can dream. I'd also like to see a return of universal special rules. Effectively, Games Workshop's keyword system, where they've keyworded some units to be able to fly or be characters, which also comes with some rules connotations, which is a bizarre system, but used to be much simplified in earlier editions. In 8th edition, Games Workshop got an enormous hard-on for reducing the size of the rulebook so they could use it as a marketing scheme. But in doing so, had to do away with this universal special rules system, which is, it's like game design suicide. This change would mean that rules like, quote, feel no pain, which allows a unit to shrug off damage on a particular dice roll, or Deep Strike, which allows a unit to set up on the table 9 inches away from enemies, would be codified to work the exact same way across every unit that has it. This opens up a whole world of possibility, allowing other units to interact with them in unique ways without needing hundreds of pages of FAQs and clarifications to make them actually work. I think this is a possibility for the new edition. While the datasheets remaining the same across editions may point to this not happening, I could see a very heavy FAQ wrapping all these different rules up into a universal special rule once 9th edition releases. I'd also like to see easier force organization rules. It does sound like GW is moving this way, since they did announce that 9th edition would see less souped armies and more single faction armies, but I definitely like to see it taken to its logical extreme. Right now, force organization is impossibly dense. It is one of the largest barriers to entry for a new player trying to build a list in the game. And without resources like Battle Scribe, functionally impossible. The new army building app that Games Workshop did release could potentially see the system remain the same and just aided by a more friendly user interface, but that doesn't really solve the core problem. I do think this change is a possible one, and I hope we see a more limited range of possible detachments and moved towards requiring detachments to belong to a single subfaction, for example, Space Marines or Grey Knights, not simply Adeptus Astartes. But I guess we'll find out when 9th edition comes around. Next up on my wish list, I would like to see a total cleanup and overhaul of the Assault phase. Right now, the Assault phase is unquestionably the most complex phase of gameplay in 40k. In the current system, some games, if close combat is reached on turn 1, grind to an absolute standstill and become boring exercises in knowledge of rules minutia and millimeter perfect placement. While I do like the skill component of this phase of the game, it quickly becomes tedious and stupid, and often makes the game run way too long. I'd like to see an overhaul of the system to remove the multiple moves per combat step, the bizarre must-move closer movement requirements, and arcane rules for engaging enemies. Just let units that successfully charge make all of their attacks into their target, then move 6 inches in any direction. Easy peasy, dunsies. We just stripped 30 minutes off the total game time, while making the Consolidate rules a little more interesting. Last but not least, but on a similar vein to an Assault phase overhaul, I'd like to see Overwatch and Fallback either nerfed or removed. If the designers are serious about making 9th edition buff melee armies, this is a change that absolutely needs to happen. And it is one that I think we could see. Melee units, especially ones without access to exceptional resilience, like characters, for example, that can't be targeted by ranged attacks, or extreme threat ranges like Eldari or Tyranids, already have an immensely difficult time reaching the enemy, only to give their targets free attacks on them and the ability to leave and allow the rest of their army to finish the job. In my opinion, Overwatch is stupid and makes no sense, and makes some units in the game virtually unassailable in close combat, and while falling back does make the game a little bit more interesting, units like Flyers being able to do it with impunity without being able to be wrapped, and then still make ranged attacks themselves, is truly broken. Offering units in melee that are fallen back from a benefit, like a penalty to hit with subsequent ranged attacks, or something like a free 6-inch move to return back to cover, makes the maneuver much riskier and more interesting. And I can't imagine Flyers retain the ability to fall back and shoot when 9th edition rolls around. This, compounded with the previewed change of vehicles being able to fire well in melee, I think make tanks instead of frontline infantry the answer to melee aggression, which makes a lot more sense in universe. So anyway, that's just my thoughts and review on the 9th edition preview. I am unreasonably excited to see more previews from the 9th edition rule set, but I hope the GW truly has learned from their mistakes, and the 9th edition rollout isn't the unbalanced crap show that previous editions have been. But really, I'd like to know what you guys are excited about in the new edition. Is it points rebalances, the new Crusade Legacy format, or maybe rules that we haven't even seen yet? Let me know down in the comments, and remember to check out Tactical Tortoise on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, where you can get all sorts of cool benefits like early access to videos, early access to T5S2 tournament pods, and patron-only exclusive videos. Thanks for watching. Remember to keep it classy, folks. and have happy wargaming.
Yeah.